Welcome to a short history of Venezuela. What is the history, you ask? Well, let's dive in. Thank you for watching Where the Past Lives. I'm your host, Brandon Foster. Where the Past Lives is dedicated to bringing history to life however possible. If you love history, especially medieval history, then this is a place for you. Support my work by liking and subscribing. You can also financially support my work through the link below. Thank you and enjoy the show. So Venezuela, to begin with, a little political info, is found in the northeast of South America. It's one of the topmost countries in that continent. It is actually known as the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Its population is about 29 million, and it is approximately 900,000 kilometers squared. So, pretty big country with a good population. Let's now dive into the early history. As all places, there were lots of people very long ago, and archaeologists and historians believe that Venezuela had a population starting around 15,000 years ago. We have found artifacts like spear tips, agriculture, hunting, gathering type of stuff, and other lots of tools. And we have dated them around 13,000 to 7,000 BCE, which stands for before Central Era, or BC, before Christ, for those that use the more traditional dating system. The pre-Spanish history is just like many other places of its kind. It's very difficult. This is the same as back in the Germanic migrations or pre-colonial in Africa. There wasn't much of a written language, so it was hard for us to know exactly what the cultures were like. We, of course, have stories passed down and we have archaeology, but that's about it. We don't have a lot of other stuff giving us any type of political formations or really anything that can give us an actual history. But we do know some things, and we can guess on some of the others or really infer based off of archaeology. It is believed that there was about 1 million people that lived before the Spanish arrived in Venezuela. We have some of the tribes are the Calina, the Caque, I'm going to butcher some of these names, so I apologize. The Cacuitio, the Marique, and the Timoto Caracas. So that last one, the Timoto Caracas, we have a lot more about them, and they were a much more complex society. Complex meaning more agrarian. That's one of the things historians define as complex. So they had permanent villages. We know that they were surrounded by agriculture. We found that in archaeology. And they had terraced fields. So a terraced field is usually on the mountainside or a hill, and it kind of goes down in what you would call a terrace. And that way watering and stuff, other things happen more easily. And it's a sign of advancement in technology and agricultural practices. The villages themselves were made of stone with thatched roofs, so very reminiscent of other cultures, especially you'd find in like Europe and stuff. And again, they were an agrarian society, and they focused on potatoes, which I love potatoes, and ulucos. Arapas, which is a food, is believed to have originated with this people. Just like the rest of the New World, as we call it, or North and South America, they were not exposed to any type of Old World diseases. And unfortunately, like the rest of the New World, they were ravaged by these diseases, and a large part of their population was no more. This leads us to the era of colonization. So the Spanish are now arriving, and they arrived in 1522. This was shortly after Columbus, sailed the ocean blue, and he arrived in 1492, as the popular saying goes. He sailed around the Caribbean for a while, and he actually saw part of South America and part of Venezuela. A weird thing that I found when I was doing my research in this is that the Germans actually owned parts of Venezuela for a short amount of time. The family, the Welser family, was granted land in Venezuela by the German and Spanish governments. This could only happen because Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Spain. So he was in charge of both areas during parts of this time. So between 1528 and 1546, the banking family of the Welsers, they owned extensive amounts of Venezuelan land. And this was one of the only German colonizations of the Americas and the most extensive. So Charles V, and yes, this is the Charles V that was being annoyed by Martin Luther, he owed the Welser family money because they helped finance his election or the bribery to become elected. So in 1528, they were given permission to colonize and rule parts of Venezuela, or the whole whatever counted as Venezuela at that time. While they were ruling during this kind of almost 2-decade period, they brought thousands of slaves to work sugarcane. This was one of the first times slaves were brought in to do that. And this was during this century at least, I'm not sure during these decades, but Catholicism became a prominent religion that many of the people started to convert to or converted to. And again, sugarcane became a very important economic source during this time. The Germans, ironically, could not handle the weather and the climate in the tropics. So actually many of them died due to disease. So you can kind of call that a form of karma. Most of the colonization was done around the coastline that was very easy to get to in Venezuela. But the Orinoco River allowed them to colonize farther in, and the Yequana tribe actually tried to resist their colonization, but they were eventually not successful. Because of their resistance and the resistance of other tribes, we had people that were the leaders, or the caciques, however you say it, sorry. And I'm going to butcher this name. One of them was Guayquepero and Tamanaco. They tried to resist Spanish colonization, and they were successful in varying periods. They were actually one of the first colonies to proclaim independence, which happened in 1811, so almost 300 years of colonization from 1522 to 1811. And this happened under Francisco de Miranda. He actually fought in the American and French revolutions, which would be an interesting story to delve into. And he created the first Republic of Venezuela. This happened on July 5th, 1811. Unfortunately, it crumbled 2 years later in 1813 because of internal and external reasons. Simon Bolívar, who's a very famous general and sometimes called the George Washington of South America, though I think he deserves a better nickname than that. He launched what's called the Admirable Campaign in 1813, and he formed the Second Republic of Venezuela. It only lasted a few months before José Tomás Boves and other royalists took control of the government and ended the Second Republic. Because of French campaigns in Spain happening in 1814, this would be the very end of Napoleon and all of that, Venezuelans were able to fight, and they started the Third Republic of Venezuela in 1817. Just so you know, we're in the Fifth Republic today. The Congress of Angostura terminated the Republic, and it brought Venezuela into the Republic of Colombia, which was a large section of land in Central and South America. The Battle of Lake Maracaibo officially ended the all the battles to end all the stuff. Can't think of the word I'm looking for. And it established Venezuelan independence. And this happened on July 24th, 1823. So a little over a decade of warfare to secure its independence. It would remain part of Gran Colombia until about 1830, when Jose Antonio Páez led a rebellion and formed an independent Venezuela on September 22nd. Even though all these countries, they were under the Gran Colombia, they wanted to be more independent themselves. So many of the countries that we know today would break away from Gran Colombia, and Gran Colombia would end. This brings us into other sections of the 19th century. So now Venezuela is its own independent nation. And from its get-go, it was known for political turmoil, dictatorships, and just political corruption. And we see that for many, many decades, and actually almost 200 years. Jose Paez and Antonio Guzman Blanco are two examples of these dictators. And yes, that was one of the guys that led Venezuela to become an independent nation. Unfortunately for Venezuela, it had a territorial dispute with Britain. So Venezuela is right next to Britain, Guyana, and they believed that the certain section of land known as the Essequibo territory, if I'm saying that correctly, they thought it belonged to them. The British thought it belonged to them. Everybody was fighting over it. So Venezuela reached out to the United States. They had a ambassador go over and diplomat do its thing. And the United States, since the 1820s, had the Monroe Doctrine, which is a very famous doctrine in American history. So the Monroe Doctrine said, just for those who can't remember, that anything within the Western Hemisphere could not be bothered by European powers. So what they said was, if the old powers, so those in Europe, tried to, influence anything politically in the New World, the United States was going to step in and deal with that. But when it was initially proclaimed, it had no power. The United States was not a world power yet. But now that we're later, this is after the Civil War under President Grover Cleveland, the United States was able to back up this kind of proclamation or threat, you can even call it. So President Grover Cleveland, he intervened, again, believing anything within the Western world fell under this doctrine. But unfortunately for Venezuela, a tribunal in Paris in 1898, they said most of it belonged to Britain. And so it didn't end in Venezuelan it didn't end their way, but it was a way for them to enter the world scene. Now, the 20th century dawns, and liquid gold was found during World War I. But this would cause a lot of good things and bad things. So by the mid-1930s, Venezuela averaged a GDP, which gross domestic product, for those who don't know, was the highest in Latin America. So Venezuela was an incredibly rich nation after oil, liquid gold, was found. The economy boomed, and this allowed Venezuela to move from an agrarian economy to a more modern. They were able to start industrializing. And this would last well into the 1980s. So almost for about 50 years, they had this prosperity. Unfortunately, the oil did not solve corruption. There was still lots of corruption. And during this time, the 1930s, 1940s, we saw dictatorships, limited political freedom, and other forms of political turmoil. The first free election happened in 1947 when Romulo Gallegos became president. He was elected, and this is considered one of the first free and fair elections, though it would not last. He was overthrown by a military junta by Luis Felipe Llavera Perez, Marcos Perez Jimenez, and Carlos Delgado Shulbad. Again, I hope I'm saying these names right. My Spanish can be good, but also can be terrible. This Puntifio Pact controlled politics for about 4 decades. So again, this happened in the kind of 40s, early 50s, and it would last into the 80s, 90s. Internal fighting occurred off and on during these decades. People did not like what was going on, and they fought it, sometimes violently, sometimes not. During the 70s, the energy crisis occurred, and this would lead to even more economic prosperity because prices started to surge, especially this would happen during the Nixon administration, the Carter administration, and it would end in the 80s during the Reagan administration. And during Venezuela, or in Venezuela during this time, centralized spending increased. A lot of things were centralized, but they did increase the national debt. When oil prices stabilized in the 80s, again under the Reagan administration and the deregulation of oil prices, which is again a fascinating study, the Venezuelan economy started to plummet. This was due to a lot of the economics being based on oil prices. And again, it was very centralized. Due to this economic hardship, the government started to decentralize its political system, and its economy also became decentralized because it could no longer withstand the amount of just centralized social planning that it had become accustomed to. And this would lead to one of the most controversial periods of Venezuelan history. It started in the 80s and it actually ended in 2013. And this is the political life of Hugo Chavez. So he started his kind of political life in 1982. And he promised at that time that he was going to depose the current government. He tried to lead two coups in the 1990s, both, I believe, in 1992, and he failed both times. But he was pardoned by Rafael Caldera at the very end of his career, and he won an election because he was now able to run for election in 1998. And he would remain in power mostly until 2013 with a very short stint where he was kicked out of power, but he came back in. Right at the get-go, he made a new constitution, him and his political colleagues. It wasn't just him. And he started what's called the Bolivarian Revolution, hence why the new republic is called the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. And he tried to implement what was he called a popular democracy, so popularism, also just a mask for socialism. And he tried to make Venezuela economically independent. He tried to have equitable distribution of revenues and an end to political corruption, though that last one definitely would not end. Chavez started, as we said, the Fifth Republic of Venezuela, or again known as the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. His United Socialist Party of Venezuela has dominated politics since his election in 1998, and that actually continues into now of 2026. He was briefly out of office from 2002 to 2004. A coup happened and he was kicked out of power, but he would quickly regain power and become elected back in 2004. To stop further coups, he promoted state television and heavily restricted private media. So like all dictators, he limited media so that all news came through him. U.S. sanctions were imposed on Venezuela in 2008, and then the EU, Canada, Mexico, Switzerland, and Panama also put out their own sanctions on Venezuela. Under Chavez's presidency, economic inequality declined, quality of life improved, poverty declined, the economy grew, but social spending per person tripled. So again, during this time, oil prices were very good for Venezuela, or had become, again, very good for Venezuela. But so they were able to spend a lot via the government, which can be great until those things end, which occurred in 2008. So for the first almost 10 years of his presidencies, he had this large budget to spend with. So in 2008, when the global economy crashed, Venezuela was hit very hard. Oil prices dropped, and Venezuela did not react very well, unlike some other countries. And growth dropped, and the economy massively suffered. Its currency became overvalued, meaning they had to do something like create inflation. and the government continued to devalue its currency more over the next decade. So it'd be from 2008 into 2020. Social engineering and corruption lost all the profits from oil that they were having, so they were no longer able to, again, offer these good lifestyles for people because the government was no longer handling those profits well. This then leads to the next major political figure, Nicolás Maduro, who again is another controversial person of the modern time. So Chavez was elected in 2012, but he was not in good health, and he actually never swore in. So in 2013, before he passed away, he gave his presidency to Nicolás Maduro, though they also claim that he won the presidency. He would hold power until today, though not today. The other night ended that. Potentially. There's still, who knows what's going on. His 2013 election was contested for fraud, but the official sources said nothing happened. It was legitimate. He continued to devalue the currency, which led to health issues because food like milk and other things were not able to be purchased by the average person, and that led to malnutrition. The economy that had relied heavily on oil exportation, but when the oil prices continued to drop, the social programs, they could no longer hold them up, and the economy and the people started to suffer. Again, corruption continued, and the Venezuelan crisis just would get worse and worse until it was an official crisis. The debt increased from $3 billion to $35 billion during this time, and by 2015, they had reached the world's highest inflation rate, which is absolutely terrible. This led to mass emigration, people leaving a country, about 7.7 million people between 2014 and 2024. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans who stayed protested levels of crime, corruption. They protested the hyperinflation and the lack of basic goods. There was not a lot to go around, and people were getting very angry about it. Because of how the Venezuelan government handled those riots, the answer is very poorly. They would lock up opposition leaders like Leopoldo Lopez and Antonio Ledesma. They would, do all the typical police brutality and stuff. The Obama administration put unilateral sanctions on government officials that were involved in the crackdown of the protests. And by 2016, Maduro proclaimed an economic emergency in Venezuela. But one of the biggest things was that just expanded his power, which didn't help anything. So committees, which were called CLAPs, were created to handle local food distributions because there was so little food to pass around. They needed to have these basically bread lines controlled by the government. The Supreme Tribunal, which was aligned with Maduro, took control of the assembly's functions. And the assembly is a form of Congress, and they were trying to pass laws, but Maduro had his people blocking most of those laws, and it became this huge fight, political fight. So the Supreme Tribunal took control, and they eventually just removed all of the power of the assembly. And this raised concerns of a dictatorship being formed. In 2017, so the next year, President Trump's administration imposed more sanctions on the Venezuelan government. And then in 2018, Maduro ran and won the election. But Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, Germany, France, Canada, and the United States all thought it was fraudulent and did not believe the results. And they actually recognized his opponent, Juan Guaido, as president. Though that didn't actually change anything. He still was in charge of Venezuela. He was indicted. He was indicted in 2020, along with other Venezuelan officials, on drug trafficking charges. In the 2020s, so now into our decade, by the beginning of the decade, Venezuela had become one of the poorest countries in Latin America. It went from being one of the richest by the 1980s to one of the poorest by 2020. Over 20% of the population tried to emigrate or did emigrate, again, which is people leaving a country, moving somewhere else. And in 2024, Maduro ran and won another election against Edmundo Gonzalez. Though before the election, most of the polls said that Gonzalez was going to win a massive victory. But somehow, Maduro just snuck past with a narrow victory, which many countries thought was completely fraudulent. So many world leaders, they did not even recognize the victory. Both claimed victory and both said they were president. And even the Carter Center did not recognize the result of Maduro's victory. And that leads to this year, 2026. And as of January, Maduro has been captured by the United States government, and who knows what's going to happen. So, as a short history, this ends because we are now no longer in the past, and only time will tell what the future has to hold. Thank you for watching this short history of Venezuela. If you enjoy these types of things, then you should like and subscribe my video. I know this is not terribly short, but condensing a whole history is hard. All right.